Thank you for coming out on a cold Saturday night for writing and writers. Give yourselves a hand. Cool. Welcome to the Loft Literary Center and Open Book. My name is Bao Phi, Program Director at the Loft Literary Center, a local nonprofit founded in 1974 in Dinkytown. The Loft advances the artistic development of writers, fosters a thriving literary community, and inspires a passion for literature. Our core values are that literature is essential, writing can be taught, inclusiveness is imperative, boldness brings excellence, community makes us strong, and wise management fuels our success. Please visit us at www.loft.org for more information regarding our many offerings to writers and readers. We have everything from classes to workshops to spoken word shows to major awards like what we're celebrating tonight, which is the McKnight Fellowships for Writers. We're here because Luis Rodriguez was the distinguished judge for this round of the McKnight Fellowship. The McKnight Artist Fellowships for Writers awards $25,000 annually to 5 accomplished Minnesota writers. These fellowships are funded by the McKnight Foundation, so big thanks to our partners at McKnight. The Loft administers the McKnight Artist Fellowships for Writers, which provide Minnesota writers of demonstrated ability with an opportunity to work on their writing for a concentrated period of time. 5 $25,000 fellowships are awarded, and one award in children's literature alternates annually between writers for children under the age of 8 and writers for older readers. 4 fellowships alternate annually between writers of poetry and spoken word and writers of creative prose. The awards this year will be in poetry and spoken word and children under the age of 8, and the application for that just closed. But Louise was the judge for prose, and we actually, part of tonight is we want to honor the winners, the Minnesota winners. Not everybody could be here, but for those of you who are here, when I say your name, could you just stand and remain standing, and we'll all applaud you at the end of the night, okay? So Matthew Batt, Eric Braun, Susan Kofod, Kao Kalia Yang, and Ann Ursu. I don't think Ann could make it today, but can we give our Minnesota McKnight writers a hand, please? Thank you all. You can sit down now before people memorize your faces and ask you to borrow $25,000 at the end of the night. And again, thank you very much to our partners at McKnight. Before we begin the reading, a few housekeeping notes. Please turn off your cell phones. There will be a reception tonight. I ordered a lot of food. This is I just stepped in the program director position. This is my first McKnight reading, so I over-ordered. So make sure you stay for that. It's free. And there's also a book signing following the reading. Books will be sold by our partners at Majors & Quinn, a local independent bookseller. I'd like to thank all staff and volunteers of the Loft and McKnight. Special thank you, of course, to Jared Santek, the previous program director, who had the very good taste to ask Luis Rodriguez to be the judge this year. When they asked me to take over, one of the things that I looked forward to was like, I get to do this. So thank you to Jared. And before I introduce Luis, I'd like to take a moment to dedicate this reading to the memory of a friend of ours, Brandon Lacey Campos, a local poet, a community organizer, and a dear friend to many of us. Today happens to be the 1-year anniversary of his passing. If he were alive, I know he would love to be here and to meet you. So we remember you, Brandon. And we want to dedicate this reading to you. This evening's reader is Luis Rodriguez. Luis is convinced that a writer can change the world. Indeed, it is through education and the power of words that Rodriguez saw his own way out of poverty and despair in the barrio of East LA and successfully broke free from the years of violence and desperation he spent as an active gang member. Achieving success as an award-winning Chicano poet, he was sure the streets would haunt him no more, until his young son joined a gang himself. Rodriguez fought for his child by telling his own story in the bestseller Always Running, La Vida Loca, Gang Days in LA, a vivid memoir that explores the motivation of gang life and cautions against the death and destruction that inevitably claim its participants. Always Running earned a Carl Sandburg Literary Award and was designated a New York Times notable book. It has also been named by the American Library Association as one of the nation's 100 most censored books, so you know it's good. Rodriguez's latest book is the sequel to Always Running, entitled It Calls You Back, an odyssey through love, addiction, revolutions, and healing. It is also available in audio through Dreamscape Audiobooks. In 2012, It Calls You Back was longlisted for the National Book Critics Circle Award in the autobiography category. Rodriguez is also known for helping start a number of prominent organizations, such as Chicago's Guild Complex, one of the largest literary arts organizations in the Midwest. Rockamole Productions, which produces music and art festivals, CDs and film, and Youth Struggling for Survival, a Chicago-based nonprofit community group working with gang and non-gang youth. In addition, he is one of the founders of the small poetry publishing house, Tia Chucha Press, as well as Tia Chucha's Cafe and Centro Cultural, right? Bookstore, coffee shop, art gallery, performance space, and workshop center in the San Fernando Valley section of Los Angeles. An accomplished poet, which is how I first read Luis. He's the author of several collections of poetry, his latest being My Nature is Hunger, New and Selected Poems. His poetry has won a Poetry Center Book Award and a Penn Josephine Miles Literary Award, among many others. He also writes books for children. America is Her Name, and It Doesn't Have to Be This Way, a Barrio story published in both English and Spanish, have won several awards, including a Patterson Young Adult Book Award and a Parents' Choice Book Award. Rodriguez is also the author of Hearts and Hands, Creating Community in Violent Times, and a novel, Music of the Mill. He recently co-edited Rushing Waters, Rising Dreams, How the Arts Are Transforming a Community, with the Denise Sandoval. Luis Rodriguez's honors include a Lila Wallace Reader's Digest Award, a Lannan Fellowship for Poetry, a Hispanic Heritage Award for Literature, a California Arts Council Fellowship, and several Illinois Art Council Fellowships. He was one of 50 leaders worldwide selected as Unsung Heroes of Compassion, presented by the Dalai Lama. In 2012, he was named one of LA Weekly's most interesting people in Los Angeles. I would like to be designated an interesting person someday. Luis Rodriguez also conducts workshops, readings, and talks in prisons, juvenile detention facilities, universities, migrant camps, Native American reservations, conferences, public and private schools, and homeless shelters. He addresses the complex but vital issues of race, class, gender, and personal rage through dialogue, story, poetry, and art. And the last thing I will read is some of his own words. Art is the heart's explosion on the world. There's probably no more powerful force for change in this uncertain and crisis-ridden world than young people and their art. It is the consciousness of the world breaking away from the strangle grip of an archaic social order. So, Minnesota, please welcome Luis Rodriguez.
Good evening. Thank you, thank you. I'm going to start with a poem. The calling came to me while I languished in my room, while I withered away my youth in jail cells and damp patio fields. It brought me to life out of captivity in a street-scarred and tattooed place I called body. Until then, I waited silently, a deafening clamor in my head, hidden from America's eyes, a brown boy without a name. I would sing into a solitary tape recorder, music never to be heard. I would write my thoughts in scrambled English. I would take photos in my mind, plan out new parks, bushy green, concrete-free, new places to play and think. Waiting. Then it came, the calling. It brought me out of my room. It forced me to escape night captors and street prisons. It called me to war, to be writer, to be scientist, and to march with the soldiers of change. It called me from the shadows, out of the wreckage of my barrio, from among those who did not exist. I waited all of 16 years for this time, somehow unexpected. I was called. I wanted to read that poem because it was actually one of the first poems I ever wrote, and I was 16 years old and sitting in Murder's Row of the Hall of Justice Jail in Los Angeles. I had a cell right next to Charles Manson. And this is a story that I tell in Always Running. It's one of the stories that don't get told very often, but I was actually arrested during the Chicano moratorium against the Vietnam War. And what they did is they arrested hundreds of people and they let most of them go after 2 or 3 hours. About 5 or 6 of us they kept, and I was one of them. We were the cholos, the gang members, and they wouldn't let us go. We ended up going in the Hall of Justice murders roll because they were going to charge us for the murders of the people that died in the subsequent riot of the Chicano moratorium. Several people were killed and there was $1 million worth of damage. LA, as you know, is like riot city. You know, every once in a while there's riots. As you know, the two biggest ones in the last 60 years occurred there. And the East LA so-called riot was one of the ones that happened. They couldn't charge me for that, but I knew one thing. I got politicized in that process. And it's kind of a weird way of getting politicized. I knew that Charles Manson, for example, was being taken care of. They were not going to let anything happen to him. He was the only white guy in a row of black and brown people, a whole tier. And they protected him because he was racist. He was calling people out. And he had a special cell on his own. And when they would let him out in the tier, we would have to be behind bars ourselves. And then when we were out in the tier, they kept him away. But the first night I was there, people put razor blades to my neck and were trying to kill me. And I recognized soon after that I stood up to these guys, so that kind of saved me because I had already been in the streets. I already knew whatever happens, you don't show any fear, even if you're scared to death. So I stood up to these guys, and they thought it was cool. But I knew one thing, that if I woke up with my throat cut the next morning, who would care? Luis Rodriguez was unimportant, even to Charles Manson. So I began to realize the importance of telling these stories, the importance of telling our narrative, to be able to express and shape poems and stories and memoirs and anything that can give people a knowledge of who we are. And there's so many knowledges and so many stories that need to be told. So I'm going to share a few of them, but before I start, I want to read what I wrote for the winners of the McKnight Fellowship. First of all, congratulations to all of you who won. I didn't know who you were, so I just read the manuscripts, and then I was able to pick the best ones. And I'm just going to read what I wrote in general for the whole thing. It was a pleasure to read and judge these submissions. The ideas and all the pieces were strong, the stories original, and the language rich. This made the 2013 Loft Awards for Creative Prose a hard contest to judge. I wish I could give more awards. However, in the end, the ones that resonated with me longest, that still surprised with each read, that kept a spell over me long after I left the page, a haunting, if you will, ended up as winners. Sometimes it was the juxtaposition of words, or how a story kept opening up like a blossom, or the interesting combination of humor and seriousness. I also took stock of the emotional well the pieces were drawn from. Such judgments are dependent on conditions, time, and place. Yes, objective and highly subjective. It's possible if I read these entries 2 years ago, I may have picked other winners. On the other hand, I seriously doubt this. The winners were the ones that ultimately called to me as a writer, an editor, and a voracious reader. The middle of this country is truly a heartland of complex and compelling literature. So I wanted to read that in honor of all the winners. What I wanted to do was actually not so much read poetry, but read from the prose. But I think one of the things about, I guess what I want to convey is how even if, as a writer, as somebody who might have accomplished a few things, and I have, and I feel very honored and grateful that I've been able to achieve what I have achieved. It has not been an easy road, not just because it's hard to be a writer for anybody, particularly hard to be a writer of color, but this is not a very poetic country. It's a very poetic country everywhere except in the center of it. You know what I mean? I mean, you go to high schools, everybody's doing poetry, everybody's writing all the time, but you go to the center of the country, poetry is marginalized. Nobody can make a living out of it except for very few. Most of them have to be teaching just to survive. So it's kind of weird how we've become so unpoetic as a country. And of course, you go to other countries, and I've been able to go to other countries, and people love poetry. People thrive in poetry. I remember maybe 30 years ago when I was in Nicaragua, the land of poets. Everybody was a poet. Mexico, the declamación that everybody would do. They grew up. My mother used to recite poetry when I was a kid. In Japan, a poetry book sells 3 million copies. Poetry book here, if it sells 1,000, that's a bestseller. That's it. You made it, you know. So it's kind of sad that we have a country that doesn't really support poetry. But I also think it's kind of true for any really good writing. I think there's a lot of good writing in this country. We are known, it's kind of funny because we're actually known around the world as a land of where great poets have come from. Everybody loves Whitman and Dickinson and Ginsberg, and everybody reads all that. And there's a lot of great literature coming in this country. But I also find that it's still very narrow. You know what I'm saying? It's still a few people. It's not the full story. You know what I mean? It's not the full country. It's not the contributions that should be made. And I'm not just talking about, of course, people of color, the different countries that have migrated here from Latin America, from Asia, from Europe, from Africa, but also even among white people, the poor whites, the marginalized so-called white trash that everybody wants to talk bad about. You see more against white trash people than anywhere else on TV. You know, they're more, I think, hit at really badly than anybody else, and there must be a reason for that. Mainly because if they ever got revolutionized, this country wouldn't last too long. You know, so. But I think that it's just those stories that don't get told, and stories of the original peoples and the native peoples of this land. There's some great writers, and we know them, but I know there's more stories that don't get told, and people die without their stories being put out there. So one of the things I wanted to express is why I ended up writing these two memoirs, even though I started off as a poet, because I felt that this story, for example, wasn't being told. The story of a Chicano participant in gangs. I read a lot of social science studies of gangs in East LA, but never from a participant's viewpoint, which is why you always got to put your viewpoint, because the studies always get things wrong. You know, I don't care what they say, they always get it wrong. So I thought, well, I needed to do it. And it's really interesting, people don't know that the East LA gangs are some of the oldest continuous street gangs in the country. They've been around for more than 100 years. Some of those gangs are still active. And people don't know this history. You know, they think they all started like 10 years ago when supposedly immigrants came and everything, but they've been around a long time, and they influence a lot of what's called the California gang culture that now is spread out around the world. California gang culture is very prominent everywhere. You see it all over the country. It's being pushed in movies and in music, and a lot of it was related to the Chicano gang culture. So I needed to tell that story. Fortunately for me, the timing was perfect because it came out a year after the LA rebellion. And that was very helpful because now people wanted to know what's up with these LA gangs. They wanted to know about LA. And so it just helped a lot. And timing is part of the magic of when you do art. And you never can plan for that. But it helped the book so much because now we've sold 500,000 copies of this book. And even though I love all my other books, I have 15 books, they don't do nowhere near as much, and I regret that because I love all my books. But it's okay. I guess if an author can say they have one book that's a bestseller, they're like happy. So I'm very honored that that happened. But the book, I think, sells because, again, this speaks to a lot of people, and not just Chicanos, African Americans, Hmong young people, you know, poor whites in Boston. I have talked to so many young people, and they relate to the book. And that, I think, it's important, that they can see the Chicano end of it, but they also see this is my story. So that's important. So I also wanted to talk about the other memoir, It Calls You Back, because now that I've been doing all this prose writing, it's really opened me up to the power of a good narrative. And this was the hardest book to write because I had covered 40 years. This went over through my teens. It was a hard book to write, but 40 years of life and so much happened, you know. And I would tell you honestly, I gave the publisher a 800-page manuscript, you know. So it was a lot of work. Thankfully, the editor suggested I cut it down, and I'm glad it turned out it was the right thing. And now it's about 360 pages. But the point is that I think I learned, well, as I've always learned, sometimes in a concise way you can say more than sometimes just making it longer. And learning that is an art, and that takes a lot. And that's partly what I look at when people write, that they find the layers of meaning within short amount of words. You know what I'm saying? That's what a good poem does. I tell people that with a good poem, you have to hear it over and over again because you're never going to get the fullness of it at one reading. You know what I'm saying? You get other ends of it, other details, other images next time you hear it. So that's the way a good poem should be, and that's sometimes how good writing should be. I love the books that I read over and over again because new discoveries, new things happen. So this book has the issue of, okay, if I have succeeded, what's my problem then? Problem is I have a lot of problems, and a lot of us do. And the craziness that this book talked about is that you never really leave it. It's sad, but if you lived a life as a heroin addict, a gang member, if you've done violence like way I had done, you're not going to get over it that easy. And it's not going to work to tell people to get over it. It doesn't work that way. What you end up learning, and this is a very hard thing, is to carry your wounds, your traumas, your pains, and your triumphs in a character that can hold it. You understand what I'm saying? You really can't get rid of it. I wish it was possible. Anybody that tells you that, they're just misrepresenting the whole process. But you don't have to keep it so close to you that everything that happens gets triggered and then you go back to that. You know what I'm saying? You got to know how to carry this stuff. You got to know how to carry the bad things you've done and the good things. You got to know how to carry the pains that have been given to you as well as the pains you give to others. And that is what makes character. That is what makes a human being fuller. I've been striving for that. Obviously, I got a long way to go, and I don't think any human being ever gets there. But the point is, that should be the striving. And in writing, it helps more than anything to see it, to put it together, to blossom it. Like I said in the writing, how it just begins to unfold. So what called me back? The madness. And it keeps going. The madness took the form of two shapes because I got out of the gangs and crime and jail and heroin by the time I was 19 years old, which is great. It's amazing. Very few people do that. But then I had carried the madness for 40 years. It took the form of addictions, mostly drinking. I drank for 20 years after I let go of the drugs, and then hit rage. A terrible rage that was very hard for me to overcome. I'm a really nice guy. Anybody that knows me knows I'm a nice guy. I'm really quiet, but I have a rage inside of me that doesn't come out except in certain times and certain places, and I have to be careful. The worst thing that happened is 20 years ago, in fact, 20 years ago this year, I finally sobered up completely. Nothing, no drinking, nothing. And I thought that would be great. It was the hardest thing of my life to stay sober. It was the hardest thing. But I tell you what else happened. All my rage came out. I was holding back a lot of rage with drinking. And I had to address that. And I will have to say that the reason why I wrote the book is because my family, I have 4 kids, I have 5 grandkids now. I have a beautiful wife, she was my 4th wife. But they all withstood a lot of terrible things, and they've still stood by me. And they're still with me. And that, to me, is the beauty of it all. And it was really them that gave me the catalyst to want to keep trying, to keep moving on this, and finally to write this book. It calls you back. I'm going to share with you a few passages, and then I think there'll be time for questions and comments, right? Yeah, okay. And I'm going to start with the actually first part of the book. The last time I was in jail. And it starts off like this. You'll be back. These were the last words I heard as I walked away from the clanging locks and gates, the incessant yells and howls of the downtown Los Angeles County Jail. A sheriff's deputy taunted me with these words after I bailed out from being held on resisting arrest and insulting police officer charges. If convicted, I do a minimum of 6 years in the state penitentiary. The year was 1973. The charges stemmed from the police beating of a handcuffed young Mexican woman lying on her stomach on the parking lot of an after-hours club in Norwalk. Several deputies were striking and kicking her as she screamed for help. The few drunkards around sauntered away. I was high on heroin, alcohol, pills. I used to like combining those damn things. I turned to walk away as well, but something in me wouldn't let me. At 18 years of age, I felt tired, lost, after having been forced to move away from my neighborhood and a garage where I had lived in a small room with a piss bucket and a bunk, and where I got high with street girls I called squeezes. I did something no true gangster would do. I tried to stop the beating. In the process, the deputies jumped at me. I wanted to fight back, but I got laid out fast, flat onto the ground, maced and handcuffed. Before being taken to the Norwalk Sheriff Station while immobilized, I was driven around a few blocks as the deputies punched me. I yelled, "Pinchi chota, fuck you, you'll never break me, man." Or I thought I did. Maybe most of this was in my head. Either way, my words failed to break through. That is how the book starts. Um, Make a long story short, this is the first time that the community went out on my behalf. They wrote letters, they went to the judge, they went to court. It was kind of unheard of at the time, and that helped me. The judge actually gave me a break. I did not do that state time. I ended up serving time in the county jail, was let go, and after that situation, I decided to quit crime and drugs and everything. But one thing I do want to read about is what I had to do around heroin. And I'll just read you this one section. I made a crucial decision in jail. Because of my Jones with heroin, there were dudes willing to set me up, Edis and all. Edis is the rig, the kit, whatever you want to call it, outfit. For some reason, I said no. I wanted to get clean. I convinced them, and the same guys who were going to score for me now helped me through the first stages of my withdrawals. I didn't realize how bad things had gotten with Chiva and me. These dudes served as lookouts, holding the deputies at bay, ignoring me when I hollered for a hit, when I pleaded for them to forget what I requested, while my insides twisted into knots and I withered in cold sweats, cramps, slivers of pain. I yearned for another way to go. Unity not for crime or the drug trade, for real social and economic change. This derived from the political conscience I had developed and actions I had taken, including the East LA school walkouts of 1968, and more importantly, the 1970 Chicano moratorium against the Vietnam War. So I told my homie, who had come to me earlier about joining the prison gang, "Largo, I don't want to go that way," I told him. The next time my homie hit me up to do things, like run contraband or stab somebody. Largo tried his best to bring down the hammer with words and veiled threats. At one point, he said, more out of concern than as a warning, "If you don't, homie, I can't do nothing to protect you." I responded more to make a political stand and to be confrontational. "I'm not worried about what I have to do to be free. This includes from drugs, from the life. Simon, I'm all for Raza unity, but this is something else. I don't want to be a part of this." Largo didn't know what to say. To let them know I was no leva, even during Las Malias, I stepped out of my cell, not threatening or acting hard. I made my way to the day room. I wasn't hiding out, nor was I challenging anyone or playing martyr. I was making clear my position without being a pendejo in the process. Largo came up to me as I watched TV, sweat beading on my forehead, inches under the skin. "What are you going to do, homie?" he asked. "I'm going to be a warrior for a new world," I responded, as if my voice had been taken over by another person, sprouting a new tongue, energized by a new mind. "I don't want any more barrio warfare or early suicide that only hurts our communities and destroys our brothers and sisters. Everybody wants to die for the barrio. How about living for the barrio? I want to finally do something different." So I took my stand. And it worked, and sometimes it doesn't work. And nowadays, if you try to do this, you will be killed. They don't tolerate this. Came at a time in which there was still some sense of it. I want to read another passage again, going back to that time, so you get a sense of how I was in that world and how it affected me later. I had turned my life and everything else I had over to the madness. This is when I was in the gang. My identity was so intertwined with La Vida Loca that any pill to leave felt threatening. "This is my barrio," I declare. "I die for Las Lomas y que." Las Lomas was my neighborhood and my gang. Once, a short time before my last arrest during the funeral of one of my homies, a neighborhood girl warned how I'd end up the same way if I didn't stop what I was doing. "I can hardly wait to have a funeral just like this," I told her with a far-off look. "To have the mothers crying, the homies and girls missing me with all this love. That will be the best day of my life." I wanted to die in a blaze of glory for the barrio, manacled to those dark streets, those dirt roads, those scrap homes, the marked up walls. But I wasn't dying. I got close, but every time I somehow escaped death's grip, just to keep it going at it again, just to keep going at it again. La Vida Loca was a web and a lure. Dudes tattooed the spider in the web or the cross with the three rays over it, signifying the crazy life, meaning you had to carry the cross of this life wherever you went. Today, this is represented by three dots in a triangle shape. You're caught. You can't let this go. I had to break the chains that pointed to three outcomes: pinto, tecato, or muerto, a prisoner, an addict, or dead. These were the three choices you inherited in La Locura, the three things a vato would expect. The Trinity, three dots, no more responsibility, no more caring, all dreams gone. So the effort of my life was to finally own my life, because I turned it over to heroin, I turned over to the gang, and that's a very hard thing to do. It's a very hard process. And your book gets into it, but one of the things that I decided to do was to become a writer. Because one of the important things of your life is whatever you're called to do, whatever your destiny is, that's what you need to do. And you know what it is when you're most passionate about something. And for some reason, I love to read and I love to write. And I say for some reason because nobody had books in my barrio. Nobody loved books. I was one of the few guys that would go to our little tiny little library in the neighborhood that only had like 5 books, but I was reading them all. And it was important for me because I connected to story and I connected to prose and language early on. And I learned English by reading because I didn't know English actually. I only spoke Spanish in school growing up. And then so I learned English by doing it. And years later, after I got out of the gangs, after I worked in industry, I worked in a steel mill, foundry, did construction, I decided to give everything up to be a writer. And you know that crazy that is? So my family thought I was crazy that I was on drugs and gangs, but once I told them I wanted to be a writer, they gave up on me completely. That was it. So I'm going to read you a passage about that. One thing about writing is that it was connected for me, to a political orientation. I wanted to change the world, and that was important. So I'm going to read you about one of my mentors, an African-American revolutionary who in Watts, and kind of like the way he impacted me and how they all impacted me, because I think it was important to meet people like that. And this was a man that was named Nelson Peary, a bricklayer by trade. Nelson looked like your calloused working-class uncle or local street corner storyteller. He had a beer gut, a black and gray head of hair, and a goatee. He'd actually close his eyes during our talks as if sleeping, but then open them and answer our many inquiries and misperceptions. He knew exactly what everyone had said. A word about the people I studied with. They were salt of the earth folk. They looked like America, white, black, brown, red, and yellow. These leaders were mostly women, people of color, and working class. They embodied the ideals of freedom, social justice, democracy that this country uniquely contributed to the world, while fighting the empire that the U.S. ruling class was hell-bent on constructing for world dominance. They were independent and beholden to all humanity while carrying forward the most radical trends of the U.S. historical process. And they were into armed struggle. But this wasn't about guns. These arms were ideas, science, music, art, theater, organization. Nelson personified this more than anyone. He could break down complex ideas in clear and comprehensible ways. He used to say the key to explain difficult concepts simply was to understand them profoundly. Clarity on the burning issues of the day is the most important thing we can offer the American people. Nelson had us all delve into current affairs as well as history. One facet of Nelson that intrigued me was his speech making. He often soapboxed on street corners and spoke on storefront church-type halls in the most impoverished sections of town. 20 to 30 people would show up most of the time. Every once in a while, a larger presentation brought around 200. He had a mastery of facts of the daily pressures to survive, but he could be funny and grave in your head and in your heart. He moved like a Southern preacher, but also like the coolest college professor. So without getting into it, I got into journalism, and I went through my own struggles trying to be a journalist, which is very difficult. At the time, People of color were close to 20% of the population. There were less than 5% of journalists in the country. So we were the first ones, some of the first ones to make a breakthrough. And I worked for daily newspapers, I worked in radio, worked for magazines, and like a lot of us, I got blacklisted. I got blacklisted for being a communist advocate. That was the whole thing. And what it was is I was working for the San Bernardino Sun, which was San Bernardino in California at the time. It's still like one of the worst places you ever want to be at. But at the time, had the second highest murder rate in the country. And all of it was on the west side of San Bernardino, which was the black and brown community. And I was the guy covering all the murders, all the deaths. I mean, I had already been traumatized being in the streets, but now I was seeing more dead bodies than anybody should ever see, one after another. There was murders, there was suicides, there was drug overdoses, there was terrible car accidents. That freeway between San Bernardino and LA is called the Killer Freeway because more people died there than any other freeway per capita in the country. And I ended up, for 2 years, just being further traumatized. So one thing that happened though is when I got blacklisted, I couldn't work in journalism anymore. And that's just part of the nature of the work in this country. People don't realize that happens in this country, but it does, and people need to know. Of course, I've been to Mexico and Central America where worse things happen, but it shouldn't happen here, and it does. And there's no recourse. You can't go to nobody. Nobody's going to save you. Nobody's going to help you. So what I decided to do was to become an independent writer, and it was the best thing I could have ever done. I want to share with you another very personal, terrible thing, and then I want to do something about my son, then I want to open up to you. This book reveals a lot of personal aspects of my life. Some of them I couldn't bring up and always running, but I brought up in this book. And it was very hurtful to do this, but I had to. One of them is my father. I always hated my father. I hated him for a lot of reasons. One of them, he's a very cold, emotionless person who did not connect very well with the kids, with my mom. He was not a very closed-off person. I don't know how many of you have fathers like that. You know, it just seems to be a father thing. I think a lot of people tell me but you know, I always had a father, unlike some of my homies that never had dads. So I was always copied to. My dad was there, but he was never there. You know what I'm saying? The worst thing that happened to him is that years later, he got dementia, and for some reason, he started to molest little kids. I don't know if he did it for years, or whether the dementia was part of it, who knows. But what happened is that my sister found him trying to molest my daughter. And then she opened up and said he molested her. And it went from there and there. I mean, we tried to get my other sisters to speak. They all closed off. It tore up the whole family. And you know, if ever you get this kind of abuse at home, it just tears everybody up. There's no way to do it. Nothing can work. It's just a messed up situation all the way around. You can never find a good way of handling this thing. A lot of my family just closed off. Some of my family defended my dad. Some went against my sister. You know what I'm saying? I went crazy and I tried to kill my dad. I went looking for a gun because I had got rid of all my weapons, and then I said, if I'm going to need a gun, this is the time to do it. And I was looking for a gun because I was going to shoot him. And fortunately for me, because it's just the way things worked out, I was living with my third wife, and she was a therapist. She did a lot of genetic counseling, but one of the things that she had to learn was, therapy. She was very helpful. She helped me a lot because she talked to me and she helped me understand I'm not going to save my family. I'm not going to save nothing. Me thinking I'm the hero here, I'm going to kill my dad and think that's going to resolve anything. You know, I mean, I had to change my perspective and everything. And I finally just said, okay, I let it go, but I hated my dad all my life. It took me a long time not to. Anyway, I want to read you one of the last passages I wrote about him. And it goes like this, because it also shows the depth of what you have to go through. The sad thing about my father, like a lot of men who abuse people, is they're the people you love. That's the sad thing. They're not the monsters everybody wants to make them out to. He was a very nice guy to everybody else. My sister, if she could find the language, would express how devastating it was for her to be molested by him because she loved her dad. You know what I'm saying? And this is the hard thing about this. It's not an easy thing to go. I wish I could demonize him like everybody else. Everybody wants to do that. It's just not that easy. I'm not going to let him off the hook. I'm not. But I can't make him that monster because, it's a complex thing. And I didn't understand this until when he died, so I'm going to read you the last part about this. My father passed away in 1992 from a quickly spreading stomach cancer. He was in his early 80s. I was in Chicago at the time. I told my mother, although not anyone else in the family, why I wouldn't come to his funeral. She seemed to understand. At one point before my father succumbed to the disease, I called Mom. My dad was at home, unable to speak, breathing his last. My mother requested that I say something to him, even if he couldn't respond. I didn't know what to say, although I heard his shallow breathing. All my life, I wanted another father. Yet, as I recall, he brought books home for me to read, even books I didn't care about. He showed me how to play chess, another obsession of his. And despite spending long hours away, he came home. Most of my young friends had no fathers. This was the only father I knew, the one given to me by forces vaster and more mysterious than I could ever comprehend. So I told him something he never told me. I love you, Dad. My mother said he had a reaction, ever so slight, to my words. The next day, he was gone. And believe it or not, I learned to forgive my father because it wasn't hurting him, it was poisoning me. And again, I'm not leaving him off the hook. Unfortunately, this is his legacy, what he done. It's going to be known, and it will be his legacy for the rest of his, that's what he's going to be known for. That's too bad. But I don't want to carry that hate, you know what I'm saying? And it's not good for me. I want to say something about my son, and then I want to open it up. The book deals a lot with what happened with my oldest son. Some of you know the story. He got involved in a gang when he was 15. We were living in Chicago. I was very hurt by this. I did not raise my son. He came to me at 13. I had a hard time trying to be his dad. Part of the catalyst for me finally stop drinking was to help my son. I had another baby coming on. I have a daughter that's 2 years old, younger than him, and I had to finally grow up really quickly. And it took a long time because my kids were struggling for me, and I remembered how my dad wasn't there for me, and I couldn't do that. Whatever my dad was, I couldn't be what he was. You know what I'm saying? So I learned to sober up, and partly was to do this. But with my son, it was very difficult because he never let go of the gang, unlike me. And as you know, at age 21, he'd already done like a year and a half in prison. He finally got arrested for 3 counts of attempted murder, and he was facing 40 years to life in the state of Illinois. He would have gotten it, like anybody, poor working class fool would have gotten it, but we fought really hard to that sentence. I spent a lot of money, spent a year and a half, a lot of time, and he's fortunate that I would do this because a lot of parents want to and they can't. He finally got convicted and given 28 years. And the funny thing, or interesting thing about it was that when he fell in the state of Illinois, you have to do 85 to 100% of your time. It's called truth in sentencing. It was declared unconstitutional when he got convicted. It just worked out, timing. So he could actually get out in half the time, which is the way it used to be. Now it's no longer that way. There was a few thousand prisoners that got in, and they got out in half the time, so he was very fortunate. So the final thing is that he does a total of 13 and a half years on that stretch. And finally, in 2010, he was released from prison. And this was a great thing for all of us. That whole time that he was in prison, I visited him 2 or 3 times a year, even after I moved to LA. I would write him letters every month, regardless of whether he wrote me or not. I just kept writing him. I just didn't want him to not know that we were concerned that he had family. He also saw me change with my sobriety, and 15 years ago, he decides to quit drugs and alcohol in prison and quit gangs. And that's a very harder thing to do. It hurt me to hear about it because I think it was great, but I also worried about him, that he was not going to make it. But he did. So 13 and a half years ago, he comes out of prison, and my son is much better, much stronger. He just got off parole this past July. That's 3 years. And what we decided to do was to go on a road trip. We drove from Chicago all the way to California, me and him. It was the most amazing trip. And it's really sad that it took that long for me and my son to get together. He's 38 years old. He's almost 40, but I'm glad it could happen. I never got that with my father, and I'm glad that me and him did. We didn't argue one time in this whole thing. We argued all the time, and we didn't argue once. It was quite beautiful. And then we did poetry readings in San Francisco and LA and in my culture center. It was really beautiful. People showed up. People loved it. And then he went off on his own, drive all the way back. He wanted to go on his own. And it was just liberating for him. He drove all the way from LA to Chicago. It took him a week and a half. And that's because he took his time, met with people. He had a great time, and I think he grew and developed. So I want to say that my son is doing very well right now, because you need to know that it's hard, and it is. The madness calls him back, but he's doing really good, and I'm very proud of him. And hopefully someday he'll come out here and read. He's a poet too. He put out his first chapbook in July. Can you imagine? He's got his own little poetry book. So. And I think what I'm going to do, because again, this is so much to talk about, but I just wanted to be quick about this, at least this part. I'm just going to read you what he wrote when he got out of jail. I asked him, write about this, and it was quite beautiful that I put it in the book. And it's just, to me, it's just powerful, that pain and hurt that families can do to each other, but also the beautiful, amazing renewal and regeneration that can happen in families. It's possible. It takes a lot of hard work, but it can happen. And my daughter just had my 5th grandson in August, so I'm very honored and glad to be able to live this long, considering that I didn't think I was going to live that long as a teenager. My granddaughter, one of my granddaughters, is pregnant, and she's going to have a baby in February, so I'm going to be a great-grandfather. So it's like, life can go on, but it takes so much work, so much attentiveness, so much caring, so much patience, so much change. Change is important. Change is possible. Change is something we all have to do. And if we do it within our families, I think we can fight for it in our communities, fight for it in our culture, fight for it in our country, because we need it. So I'm going to read you what he wrote, and I'm going to end there, and I hope you appreciate his words. This is my son's words after he got paroled. I've had over 13 years of psychological warfare. My mind has been a battlefield with many casualties. Disconnections, reconnections, everything's new. It feels good to see my kids, my family, and everyone who has supported me. It feels good to know that on this next journey of my life, I don't have to do it alone. This is a new journey for everybody. All the hardships, the struggles were not just my own. While I did time, everyone else did life. As I stepped out the prison door and saw my family and friends standing in front of me, I didn't want to look behind me. Behind me was desolation. In front of me was absolution. Now I'm going forward, taking advantage of all my support, not afraid to ask for help when needed. For too long, I was trying to do everything alone. I was selfish and weak, full of pain and full of pride, holding on to so much anger, never knowing what I was truly angry at. That's all over with. All that sadness and hurt, I want it to be gone. I look into my children's eyes, and all I can do is smile. I wake up with a smile. I walk everywhere with a smile. I smile because I finally made it home. So the subtitle is An Odyssey Through Love, Addiction, Revolutions, and Healing, drawing from the Homer's Odyssey, which really was a book about coming home. And I think if you think about it, it's like a cornerstone of the Western civilization. It's really like the theme of almost all books since then, coming home in some form or other. Not just the place, but inside yourself. And knowing that there's a home that you carry wherever you go. I think that we get situated in a place we think that's home, and we forget the whole planet is our home. And all humanity are our brothers and sisters, you know what I mean? We forget because we narrow everything down. And so I think that's what really this is about, and what the Odyssey was about so many thousands of years ago when the Odyssey first happened. And now this is the Odyssey of my own life, and getting home and then seeing my son do the same thing. So I hope that that's partly what you get from here, and I thank you for listening and for giving me the time to be here. I appreciate your audience and appreciate your support for all these great writers, the McKnight Fellowships, and for all the writers that are coming up. And I would just say, whatever you do, if you're a writer, help another writer. Bring more writers into the world. Bring more poets. Bring more storytellers. We just need it. That's what's going to save us right now. People are talking about all these things that are going to change. None's going to change unless you get your story and you get your story out. Let's make the stories what comes alive and what forces everybody to wake up to their own life, their own destiny, and their own value. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.